Whoa, I didn't know Jeremy could play so fast. Wait a minute. I know Jeremy can't play this fast. What new devilry is this? This is Music Student 101. Your hosts, Jeremy Burns and Matthew Scott Phillips.
So, Matt,
Jeremy,
what do you think about this opening song?
that sounds kind of cool. It's
Well-
very happy.
You know what I called it?
What's that?
MIDI Vidi Vici.
I love it.
As in MIDI,
Right.
I saw, I conquered.
MIDI, MIDI.
But here's how MIDI helped me
Clever.
conquer. Okay, well, let me tell you how I kind of put this all together. I sat down on my computer. I opened up a file on Pro Tools.
Uh-huh.
I set the tempo for 140 BPM
Uh-huh.
and hit record, and I just nailed it on the first take.
Nice. Really?
No, not at all. No, I passed a piano proficiency exam.
Yeah, I did too. About 100 years ago.
Yeah, but I wasn't that proficient. I got by, but what you just heard was not the tickling ivory skills that I possess.
Not the great piano virtuosity of the great Jeremy Burns. I mean, there are probably pianists who can. Well, I know there are pianists who could play that.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
It's not either one of us.
Nope. Nope. But as far as our listeners are concerned, it could have been, because unless I told you this, you would have just been like, hey, that's a pretty great thing that he did,
Yeah. You might just think we brought in a pianist or something, or that we're just that awesome.
But we don't have the budget for that.
We don't have the budget for that, or the talent for the other thing.
So here's how I conquered this piece using MIDI. I actually started off at 120 BPM.
Mm-hmm.
And then I decided I was not good enough for that.
Uh-huh.
So I cut it in half. To 60 BPM.
Uh-huh.
And I was able to pull off most of it.
I'm actually impressed at that.
Oh, well, there was even a part where I had to cut it down to 40 BPM.
I'm impressed that that's a live recording of any kind.
Well,
because with the great expansive MIDI, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here. But you could have just
Well, that's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
What you're getting at. It was a live recording at the time, but I went back and had to recut a couple of things. But even after I was done with the recording, I had to go back and take some individual notes and move them to the right place.
Right,
and,
yeah.
And make some of them a little bit louder. And
Yeah, make some of them a little bit softer. And
there's all kinds of things that I did to that without MIDI would not have been possible.
Right, yeah. Or at least would have been very difficult and time-consuming and maybe not, been worth it. Just,
Probably frustrating.
frustrating, yeah.
So
Yeah.
let me tell you how this all worked out. So thanks to MIDI, and we'll get into who or what MIDI is in a second
right.
there, I was able to go back and, after the fact, edit all these notes.
It's your magic musical fairy is what it is.
It
No,
is.
just kidding.
No, it can be, because if your tempo is a little bit off, you can go back in and take that little note and scoot it over just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If your note's a little too quiet, you can go in there and raise up the volume.
You can certainly do that. Or if you just absolutely can't play at all, you can just go in there and say, I want this note here and this note here and that note there. And
Boom, you got yourself a piece of music.
you've got yourself a piece of music.
Well, let me go ahead and tell you what exactly MIDI is.
Let's hear it.
MIDI, M-I-D-I,
Right.
is an acronym
Right?
for a Musical Instrument Digital Interface.
Yes. Right.
It's a standard language that allows the entry and edit of musical information.
Right. It's sort of code that is, I like to think of it as code that represents musical performance ideas and actions. So it's a code that's supposed to represent what note you played and how hard you hit it and how long you held it and et cetera, et cetera.
And that's just one part of it, because another part of the code is that it allows for two instruments to communicate with each other.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
It provides a standard language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you can actually sync time code between machines. So maybe you have a drum machine that's the master clock, so to speak, and all the other machines sync to that. So anytime you play something where all these machines are connected, they'll all fall in line and snap to this grid that is laid down by whatever the master clock is, which is pretty amazing. So let's see here. And it can be used in PCs, tablets, cell phones, laptops, keyboards.
One of the great things about MIDI is, even though it's often thought of as obsolete now, as in terms of actually a finished product kind of thing. Like, you don't hear a lot of radio commercials that have MIDI files anymore.
True.
But even though a lot of people think of it that way, the truth is MIDI underlines everything. MIDI underlines so much of the way music technology still works. You know, if you've ever played a video game that did not have a live orchestra, and you know, chances are you have, you're hearing some really great synthesized sounds there, but those sounds are being controlled by MIDI.
Mm-hmm.
You know, believe it or not. If you've ever worked with any kind of notation program or ever will, then you know you're working with something in which is underlined fundamentally by MIDI. You know, so Pro Tools can use MIDI. Even something that's as famous as being audio software as Pro Tools is, does know what a MIDI track is and can add it to your score, right? And so it's really fascinating. You know, we don't really think of MIDI as cutting edge technology anymore, and we don't really think of it as you know, the thing we're working with exactly, but it's very important to a lot of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
You know? It's like mustard, you know. You're not going to sit around and eat mustard, but, you know, try to eat a hot dog with no mustard on it, it's not going to taste right.
It just doesn't have that magic.
Right, yeah. Got to have the mustard magic.
Mustard magic.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about some of the things that you can do with it. One thing that I think is really kind of cool, even now we'll get into the history a little bit later on, but this technology's kind of been out since the early 80s, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I've people kind of know it, you know, as a keyboard type thing, but there's other instruments that you can actually have MIDI interfaces with.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, my first and still favorite MIDI instrument was a keyboard, but there's been MIDI guitars and basses and even drum kits, you know, they've been around for a long time.
You know, it began sort of as a keyboard thing. I think the keyboard was sort of the first thing they translated into a MIDI instrument. It just seemed the most natural. But yeah, there are breath controllers that mimic saxophones or clarinets. There are trumpet controllers that will create MIDI messages. There are MIDI guitars. You know, there are MIDI pickups for an acoustic guitar that will actually listen to this sound that your string is making and translate that into MIDI code.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of MIDI microphones. Never really seen one, but it's supposed to be there.
So if you want to turn your voice into an oboe, you can do that.
If you want, yeah, exactly.
That is
You
hilarious.
could do that. Hey, potential uses, you know, I mean, I've got a melody in my head. I want to hum it to get it down so I don't forget it. You know, you can hum into the mic and have a MIDI file version of it. Arguably, I mean, I don't know.
Go back and change it if you want to.
Right.
Which is another one of the cool things about MIDI.
Yeah, and this sounds like a great time to point out something that I tell everybody when I'm lecturing about MIDI, and even sometimes joke that it's maybe the one thing students learn in my music tech class, is that MIDI is not sound. MIDI is code.
Right.
So we are not talking about recording any kind of audio. What we're talking about is a string of ones and zeros that represents sort of your performance actions on one of these MIDI instruments, be it a keyboard or a breath controller or any of the other ones we were just talking about. And that code, it essentially records what note you hit and when, and it records some other things like how hard you hit it, you know, which we call down velocity. You know, that's your next great band name.
Yeah.
And when it was released. And there are a whole lot of other things called controllers that it can be told about, like the overall volume of all of the notes, or you know, the idea of sustain. And we can get into all of that, but know right at the very beginning that we're not talking about recording any kind of audio. Nowadays we can, computers are so huge, and there are just terabytes and terabytes of free space out there, and of processing power, and you can reasonably record the extraordinarily complex information that is a sound wave, or a collection of sound waves. MIDI, as Jeremy said, is from the early 80s, and it was trying to solve a problem to a certain extent that doesn't exist anymore, but it definitely existed back then, is that how do we store musical information on a computer? Because computers were blowing up in the 80s, right? You kids who may not remember this, but this was right when the public was sort of becoming aware of this thing called computers. They weren't at science labs and on college campuses anymore. They were becoming parts of everyday life just in the beginning of that.
Minus the RAM and the storage capacities that we have.
Yeah. Back then you could probably get, what was it, 50K onto a floppy disk? Mm-hmm. One of the big kind that were actually floppy. That's where they called them that. You can maybe get like 50K, which sounded like, come on, man, 50,000 bits of information. Oh my God, how would you ever fill that up, right?
Yeah. Which was huge back then, I suppose.
Which was just huge. 50,000 bits of information. I mean, come on, how are you ever going to fill up 50,000 bits of information?
But
I've sent emails bigger than 50K in this day and age, but yeah.
So one advantage to MIDI was it used very little
space.
Yeah,
it used very little storage space, MIDI did, because it was just code. It was just these little 8-bit messages that you could store a lot of music as MIDI and not take up that much space. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, back then, what the people who created MIDI were really trying to do was try to come up with a way to store musical information on computers in general. So we're trying to find a way to store information on your floppy disk or your computer, take that information over to your buddy's computer and have him be able to load it and get the same musical performance that you put into the thing. Just sort of make music communicate via computers is what we were trying to do.
Which at the time I think was pretty mind-blowing, and that's still pretty mind-blowing to me today.
Yeah, at the time it was extremely mind-blowing, and even if their solutions weren't always perfect, you gotta imagine what kind of a time it was, There were probably people who were thinking, why do you even want to bother to do that? Because we can record analog in the 80s, right? So
I can make it sound better than that crappy little piano. I can use my real piano and make it sound way better than this little 1980s digital piano sound you had.
Absolutely. And yet today, MIDI controls so much of what we do. Even in this age of technological wonders.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you can go back and change and control with MIDI.
Sure.
We mentioned earlier that you can enter notes real time, or you can actually program notes in. So you don't even need an instrument.
No, you don't. It's typically called step record. Mm-hmm. You can, and what you're essentially doing is, if I want a 16th note run, I can say, okay, I set it to enter 16th notes, and then say, first 16th note is C, second 16th note is D, third 16th note is E flat, etc., 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 until I get my 16th notes. And then I want a quarter note here, so let's change that. And then MIDI will play it back correctly.
And you're doing this on your keyboard, not your music keyboard.
Not your music keyboard.
Your computer
your
keyboard.
Actual computer. You can do it on your music keyboard too, but yeah, you're what you're doing is not playing. You're programming, right?
And as our bumper music has indicated, no virtuosic.
No virtuosity necessary.
Entirely necessary.
Right.
So once you've gone in, you've entered this information, you can still go back. There's a certain number of kind of musical ideas, like you said, that can be tweaked in post.
Yeah.
So now some of these include. I have a small list here. You can program or enter in real time, like the notes themselves, of course.
Sure.
Which are also called events. So the notes themselves are called events, as well as all the things you can do to adjust and tweak them, such as the pitches and the note durations, the attack and release of these notes.
Yeah, so when that note was hit.
Yeah. And when it was released.
Is this a good time to talk about the time code?
I think it is a good time to talk about time code.
Excellent.
Well, For one thing, it's a means for two MIDI machines to talk to each other.
Right. So it's a way for any two things to sort of be synced up and have both things happening simultaneously, right? So, there's not any kind of delay or any kind of freaking thing like that,
And it's considered a slave-master relationship.
Right.
Where you have one machine being the master, so to speak.
Saying, you follow my clock, and the other machine doing that.
And so maybe you have on your master machine, you've sequenced something. You've created a file, and you have all your little MIDI events.
And
and these all lie down on a kind of a grid.
Right, yeah.
And the difference between MIDI timecode and standard timecode is it seems like we have a flexible grid. We can change time and bend it.
According to tempo. So MIDI timecode. These MIDI events happen on a grid that's organized into measures, beats, and ticks.
Yeah.
There's a certain number of ticks in a beat. And then, of course, there's a certain number of beats in a measure, 4, 3, depending on your meter. Check back on that episode if you need to.
Yeah.
And in so doing, everything happened at a certain time on that grid. And you can, by changing the time the event happened, you change, where it is in your actual sequence, meaning in your actual song that you're playing or whatever, right?
But wherever those events occur, as long as they're on the master machine, all the other machines will respond and play those, no matter how you change it or where you change it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got one machine basically telling us what this time is, what this grid is, and telling all the other machines that. This is the time machine. And again, all of this, in the modern day and age, a lot of times, there's only one machine anyway, right? Your computer, your laptop. So it's all going on behind the scenes. When you're doing a sequence on GarageBand, and you say, "Oh, I wanted this loop to be over here." When you're moving everything around, what you're doing as you're clicking and dragging and moving stuff is altering the time code data for that MIDI event or that set of MIDI events. But that's all going on behind the scenes. You're just seeing, I want this over here, so I'm clicking it and dragging it over here, right?
Yeah. Your simple click and drag is causing all these little calculations.
Just massive, yeah. It's hard to.
Events.
I feel like it's hard to appreciate these days. I mean, when we were doing this back in the dark ages, we kind of had to understand this. We kind of had to manually do a lot of this, right? And just not anymore.
Nah, that's okay.
That's okay. Young whippersnappers.
So anyways, so attack and release.
Mm-hmm.
You can take how long a note is, how hard it was hit. Well, that's the velocity, actually.
Down velocity.
The down velocity is kind of how hard you hit the note.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you have tuning. You can change the tuning, the pitch. You can transpose. You can change the placement on the timeline. If you hit a note too early,
right,
you could scoot it a little bit further down the timeline.
Very useful.
Have it land right on the grid if you want to, which you have to be careful about because you don't want to dehumanize it.
Yeah, we should probably get into that at some point.
We'll get into quantizing because that's one of the bigger things. Well,
that's one of the bigger controversies surrounding MIDI, right? We need to talk about the controversies of MIDI before we're done. But
it's not a podcast without some controversy,
right?
But yeah, mainly that, and then there's another thing called aftertouch, which is to me one of the more interesting things.
Fascinating, yeah.
So if you're trying to emulate the sound of an actual instrument, so obviously people play a violin with a completely different technique than someone would play a keyboard.
Right.
But if you can get used to these aftertouch controls, you can use small variances of pressure on the key once you've held it down.
Yeah. To
morph the sound and do different things to it to make it emulate some of the subtleties that occur on a string instrument.
And this actually it gets into a question of how good your MIDI equipment is because some of the better high-end stuff has more aftertouch kind of things going on.
Yeah.
They simulate guitar fret noises and all sorts of cool stuff. Yeah.
Hey, here's something that's annoying to me.
What's that?
Because I sat here and edited several of these episodes, and I've heard this about 1 million times now. On the keyboard you have in front of you, Matt, hit that damper pedal. I'm sorry, hit that
sustain pedal. All right, sustain pedal.
Now release it. Now you might not have heard it now, but our listening audience will hear because I'll turn it up a little bit later on. Is this creaking sound that appears?
Creaking sound?
It's like, yeah. And it's almost like they put
It's almost like they simulated the creak of the pedal.
the sound of a pedal coming up and down.
Yeah, I don't hear it at the moment.
You'll hear. I'll show it to you.
Yeah, okay, definitely show it to me.
But
yeah, oh,
little
wow.
things like that.
That's annoying.
So yeah, well, you can't take it out if you want sustain, you can't take it out.
Yeah, maybe find a piano patch that doesn't do that.
Yes.
We'll talk about what that means.
Patches, yeah. But anyways, so that's just one of the many ways it kind of attempts to articulate and emulate the sounds of the original instrument.
Right, yeah. There's all sorts of interesting stuff like that they can do. And one of the big things about MIDI through the 80s and 90s were people trying to get it to sound as realistic as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of these sounds did not always sound great.
Now, where do these sounds come from?
Glad you asked, because as we said, MIDI is not sound. MIDI is code.
Right.
So you sit down at a MIDI keyboard and you start to play, and what MIDI is recording is what notes you hit when, and the down velocities and when they were taken up, and some other sort of other miscellaneous musical information.
Most everything that encompasses technique and dynamics.
Right, yeah, but it's basically a code that lists all the buttons you hit. Right, all the little things. To make that code into sound, you need a MIDI synth. You need some piece of hardware and or software that takes this code and sort of plays it into an electronic instrument, and in so doing turns it into the performance that you put into it. This was what was so brilliant back in the 80s, is that you don't record the actual sounds that were made. You just sort of have computer information that recorded a list of actions you did.
Right.
And then you take it over to your buddy's computer, and he has maybe a better synth than you do or something, or has his own synth. He puts it in and hits play, and it goes through that list of recorded actions, sends it through a MIDI synth that actually technically, and I'm using my air quotes here, plays that information out and creates the performance that you put in.
And one way that it does this is, there's really two ways that I can think of right now. Some of these sounds are fabricated by a combination of tones and attack, release, sustain, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. What we call synthesis.
Synthesis, yeah. So taking a raw sound wave and manipulating it in a way that it actually sounds like an instrument.
Yeah, you kind of just take that sound wave and screw with it until it sounds vaguely violin-ish.
So there's the fabricated way. Now also there's samples. There's the MIDI software I use, Contact.
Oh yeah, that's a sample software. Yeah.
They actually went out and sampled the Vienna Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they didn't do it. So when you sample something, you take a recording of one note. So I'll sample the A note.
Mm-hmm.
I'll play it on my violin. I'll record it.
Right.
But I'm not just going to play that one note. I'm going to play it soft.
Yeah.
A little harder.
Yeah.
All different variations of these. So each sample or recording of the actual instrument is stored on your hard drive somewhere and can be accessed when referenced by one of these MIDI events or triggers, which results in the note being played in the intended manner.
Right. And you'll probably sample more than just one note. You'll probably sample a range of notes across the range of the violin, because the violin sounds different in different registers and things, right?
Yeah, so you couldn't record an A440 on the violin, slow it down to half speed or whatever it would take to make it a 220, or an A an octave lower, and expect it to sound the same as if you would have recorded the actual note.
Yeah, and depending on your software, they don't sample every single note, but generally the more they sample, the better the sample is. Point is, what you get with samples, instead of like a synthesized wave that comes out of a MIDI synth, what you're getting is a type of actual recording. Mm-hmm. But a very small recording, one that can be triggered by, so if I set you were using Contact, if I was on my Contact player and sent my MIDI info into its first violin section setting, and then middle C, note 60 in MIDI lingo came through there. Note 60 in MIDI language triggers that first violin section playing middle C. Mm-hmm. This is and all the other stuff triggers different types of samples and things too. So this is a great example of how MIDI it really is sort of fundamentally underlying even technology that is sort of considered more advanced than MIDI. Because this sample set software technology is everywhere. Kontakt is a big one. Garrett's Personal Orchestra is a big one. East-West, oh man, I always miss this. East-West Symphonic Library. There are all sorts of sample libraries like that. And this technology came along later, right? In the beginning, we had cheesy, crappy MIDI synthesis where people were just sort of playing with sound waves until they sounded vaguely violinish.
Yes. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, oh, we all remember that. And this is, we talked about the controversies of MIDI. This is one of the big ones. It sounds like crap, right? It never sounds as good as an actual human playing, just in terms of the timbral quality of the sound.
I've got a sad MIDI story that I'm going to share with you later on.
Oh, I love it. Let's hear it.
Later on. We're going to make them wait for it to hear Jeremy's.
We'll make them wait for Jeremy's sad MIDI story. Okay.
I was taking down a peg.
Yeah, I bet. And, as technology has advanced and digital audio sampling has become a thing, these sample libraries have come out, and they can take a MIDI message and create something that sounds a lot more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
As good as live players, I think the general consensus is no. Having live players record your music is always the best thing still, I think. But definitely a lot better than those old MIDI synths used to sound.
But here's something cool. Because MIDI is just a stream of ones and zeros, and it is an actual recorded music,
mm-hmm.
You don't need like a Mogami MIDI cable.
No.
Digital either works or it doesn't.
Right.
And you can record something on a completely crappy set of samples.
Yeah.
And then go back later on and take that same MIDI file and plug it into a software that
plug it into much better samples, and it'd be a lot more awesome.
And the orchestra comes alive before your very ears.
Yeah. Or your violins could be playing back on the electric bass patch, and
Let's talk about patches. What is a patch?
A patch is basically they're also called instruments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's way more easy than it sounds.
Yeah, it is basically the type of sound you're wanting these ones and zeros to play back on. Mm-hmm. So if I want this set of ones and zeros to be my violin, then I tune it to a violin patch. If I want this other set of ones and zeros to be an acoustic guitar, I tune it to that patch. A patch just means the set of samples roughly analogous to different instruments.
Let's show a quick example. Play like a little melody on that piano.
Play like a little melody on the piano.
Something quick and easy. That, my friends, was the piano patch. Now, future Jeremy is going to go back, copy and paste that, and then play it through an oboe patch. And
swear to God, I'm not playing it again.
Nope.
I don't even remember what it was. I forgot. I refuse. So he's going to just take those ones and zeros I just threw in there, copy and paste them, which you can do because it's ones and zeros.
And then change the patch from keyboard to clarinet.
Clarinet. Let's say clarinet.
Let's give that a listen.
Yeah.
Cool, huh?
Oh, yeah. Nice work, future Jeremy.
Yes, sir. Past Jeremy thanks you.
And, of course, higher end equipment is going to have better patches on it. By better, I mean sound more realistic, number one. Have patches that have more of those after-a-touch effects that you were talking about, number two, which enhances realism.
You get what you pay for.
You really get what you pay for, yeah.
As of my current research, GarageBand, for example, a free software, does not include after-touch effects.
It does not. As a matter of fact, I can attest to, unless they've added it with some updates that I'm not familiar with, it does not, and it's bad. It's annoying. Annoying. But GarageBand is another great example of something that is heavily influenced by MIDI, whether you realize it or not.
Right.
All you GarageBand people out there who are throwing in Apple loops and having your little keyboard graphic where you just hit the notes and it records it and things, that is all MIDI.
Yeah. I want to change the tempo. I want to put this in the key of A. I don't want it in the key of G. You can't do that with
Yeah, you can't do that with digital audio. That is all MIDI. You know, we forget that in this day and age because so much of what you and I, Jeremy, used to do in the lab back in the day with MIDI is now just done in a single computer or a single iPad or whatever, you know, where, you know, there's the controller and then the controller sends the MIDI info via an interface into the computer who is doing all the storing and manipulating and editing and all that. And then the computer on playback sends that out into a synth. You know, so the MIDI studio, the MIDI setup was this thing you had to know, and you had to hook your cables up right so the flow was, you know, this is all internal now, so people tend to not appreciate it. You know, there's my old grumpy man comment for this podcast. But it's still, things like GarageBand are still totally MIDI.
And, you know, I take that back. Let me take something back, because you can take something on your computer that you've recorded in the key of A, do a pitch change, and render it in the key of B, and it not speed up.
Yeah, right. You're talking about digital audio.
Yes, I'm talking about digital audio. Right?
Oh, absolutely, you can do that.
But there's still artifacting and things that go on that doesn't quite sound exactly right. And when I say artifacting, I mean like little strange sounds that you kind of hear.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, we should do a digital audio podcast one day. Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. But you can do that, but it's going to be more time consuming than just let's put it in A.
Yes.
Because
let's push one button and make it happen.
My personal opinion, free advice here, guys. Nothing understands music the way MIDI does.
Ah.
Yeah. You know, digital audio understands sound. Yeah. Digital audio understands sound way better than MIDI does. MIDI understands music a little better than audio does. MIDI understands what the key of A means.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a little better, not perfectly, you know, but a little better than audio does. Where audio is just frequencies. You know?
Right. Just a big waveform.
Yeah,
record
waveforms.
It, reproduce it.
Yeah. We're definitely going to have to talk about that one day.
And this is not necessarily a tech podcast, but we can avoid talking about some things because that's just a part of the music world.
Yeah. And MIDI is a huge part of your world if you're a professional musician, I think.
More than you know, right?
More than you know, yeah.
But you're finding out. You're learning, as I was learning last night. As I was up 3 o'clock in the morning trying to come up with a bumper music.
We should put a disclaimer in here that Jeremy does, in fact, have a Bachelor of Arts in Music Technology. He wasn't really learning last night.
No, I was refreshing.
He's being modest.
I was refreshing. I'm lowering the bar.
I just threw this together last night at 3 in the morning.
Lower expectations means greater appreciation when you do something right. In the end.
Lower expectations equals greater appreciation.
Surprisingly, yeah. Maybe I'll just go ahead and get right into the history a little bit.
Let's get into the history, yeah.
Okay, so anyone who's heard early Pink Floyd can tell you that analog electric instruments made their way into music at least by the 1960s.
Oh, yeah, way before that. Yeah.
But we're talking about analog things. We're talking about synthesis of sound waves and that kind of stuff. We're not talking about any kind of ones and zeros or digital.
Yeah, what we're talking about is electrical pulses, really. But
which is another cool podcast.
Right?
So by the late 1970s, microprocessors were being implemented into synthesizers.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Officially making them digital instruments.
Computer tech.
In January of 1982, there was the NAMM conference. Are you familiar with the NAMM conference?
I am. You know, they still have that.
The National Association of Music Merchants.
Mm-hmm. It's still a thing. It still goes on.
Every year.
And
a lot of people go to it, and I'm always sad that I can't be one of those people. One year I'm going to go to it and just get blown away by all the cool things coming out.
Yeah, you and me both.
So there's a gentleman named David Smith who wanted to open up a discussion about like finding a universal language or some kind of universal code that all music machines and computers and so forth can use to communicate with.
Right, yeah.
Now, he was met with some adversity.
Skepticism,
and if I can only assume why, it might have something to do with all these companies and the way they want to have exclusivity.
It's more of the controversies surrounding MIDI.
Yeah, you can't be able to communicate with all these other companies because what's going to stop you from buying their stuff when you could be buying our stuff?
Right.
It's kind of like one of our major smartphone companies that we know of.
Yeah. Days. Some fruit-based company.
Fruit-based company that we all know of. And so they were kind of arguing on why this wouldn't work out, and And so when that was all said and done, some of the Japanese companies that heard this discussion approached him at the same conference and were like, well, no, we want to try and do this. This sounds like a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So during that year, in 1982, David Smith, worked closely along with Iketoro Kakahashi from Roland.
Nice.
Thank you. And they had developed this language that these two keyboard, they had, by 1983, they had proven that they can make two keyboards communicate together.
Yeah, very, very fascinating.
And these two keyboards were, David Smith busted out his Sequential Circuits Prophet 600. And then Kakahashi busted out his Roland JP6.
Ooh.
And then they connected them, and
Yeah.
you push a key on one of them, the sound comes out of the other one.
Beautiful.
And vice versa.
And that was via MIDI language.
That was via MIDI language. Now, what do we know about the MIDI language?
We learned the specific details of the MIDI message at one point back in the day.
How many days ago was that?
A lot of days ago. I know it's an 8-bit message.
Okay.
And with 8 bits, you can get numerical values as high as 128, right? Because if 00 is 0 and 01 is 1, and then 10 is 2, right? And computer programmers out here will help me out by going a lot higher than that. So if you have 8 places for a 1 or a 0, those combinations can give you the 128 numerical values that are available in the MIDI language. So everything in MIDI is either 0 to 127 or 1 to 128. So the loudest note possible will have the value of 128, and the lowest the note will play is 0. So, yeah, the notes are all going to be the same. The A that's above middle C is note 69, which makes middle C 60, and then the B right below that 59, and so on.
So this is a MIDI standard between all machines and all GM.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Controller 7, for example, is typically volume. So on a 128 note range, if you have a MIDI message that says C7, 80, that puts the volume at a numerical value of 80, whereas 0 would be no volume and 128 would be the highest possible volume. So a typical MIDI message will be, for example, in 62, the D above middle C, 80, measure 1, beat 2, tick 40.
So they've even got it down to the timing and the time code. So really all aspects of MIDI kind of are utilizing these values between 1 and 128 or 0 and 127. We already talked about how it controls the pitches, the place in the timeline.
Yeah.
The velocity. So all of these little musical ideas and attributes can be manipulated on this scale, which is divisible by 8, the number of bits in a MIDI message.
That's the numerical value that message can,
Very cool.
Yeah.
So
that's about all I know about the actual code.
I think that's all we need to know.
Yeah.
I think that makes enough sense to me without my head hurting. So anyways, back to this little conference that they had. This was 1983 when they showed up the next year at the NAMM conference.
Sure,
and,
right.
And did this. Now, since then, there's not been a lot of changes to the MIDI protocol.
Not to the basic code, no.
In fact, the basic code has stayed completely untouched. For
Yeah.
In 1991, General MIDI became a standard for the virtual instruments available on MIDI machines.
Yeah, so you want to talk about what General MIDI means?
Please.
So all of those companies who were kind of sneering at each other from across the table at that NAMM back in 1982, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, they all have this kind of détente and get together because the problem was their sort of enmity with each other. Enmity is a strong word. Their sort of siloing off of their companies was really kind of becoming a problem with what MIDI was designed to do. Remember, MIDI is designed so you play something on your little setup. You can hand that floppy disk to your buddy and he'll play it back and it'll sound the same or better, just on his patches and on his system. Well, the problem was because everybody had different setups. It was the patches that would get mixed up was like the biggest thing. And anybody who worked on MIDI back in the day had this problem. You don't save your patches or something, and your violin track is now is now an electronic thump pad or something like that, right?
Because people had different numbers or different patches assigned to different.
Right. Yeah. So patch number 001 might be acoustic piano on a Roland. The patch 001 might be a choir on something else. Problem, right?
Problem, very much.
Yeah. And this was really kind of interfering with what MIDI was originally designed to do, right?
The universal language.
Yeah, exactly. So they kind of got together and they created this thing called General MIDI, GM, which is what it basically means is this is just a way of standardizing things. And they created this little logo that, you've probably seen on keyboards and things. Anything that had this logo meant that a certain set of parameters were standard and universal.
GM logo.
Yeah. For example, patch 001 is acoustic grand piano.
Across the board.
Across the board. And there are 128 patches that will always remain consistent across all instruments with that GM logo or with that GM standard.
So if you have a $3,000 Nord keyboard, or if you have a $200 keyboard like the thing that you sit upon, that they'll still have the same patches.
001 will still be acoustic grand piano, and 002 will be, oh shoot, I used to have a lot of these memorized.
Don't need to, but the main point being is that it'll all be the same patches, but it'll sound better on the instrument that has the better samples.
Yeah, the higher end one is going to have a better version of acoustic grand piano, absolutely, yeah. And the higher end ones will also have their own personalized banks that don't have to conform to MIDI, if you want to use those, or don't have to conform to general MIDI, I should say.
Right.
If you want to use those. But there will be at least one bank of instruments on anything that says general MIDI in which those numbers all conform, so you can just transfer it back and forth from one instrument to the next.
So it's like 128 instruments divided into 16 categories.
Yeah.
Being piano, bass, wind, that kind of thing. Yeah. Based on the different kinds of instruments.
Yeah, absolutely. And that got extended to 32 at some point with General MIDI 2.
In 1999.
There you go, right.
Which was a considerable time ago.
Yeah.
Still.
Scary, because I remember 1999.
Oh, yeah, like it was yesterday. We were learning these things.
We were learning these things,
actually.
Yeah. Were you just super stoked to hear about General MIDI 2?
I don't remember. But I know that I wouldn't have had to worry about keeping up with the technical journals between now and then because the MIDI hasn't changed much. Other than the General MIDI 2 allowed for more controller events.
Yeah.
But the ones that were still there.
Talk about controllers.
But the ones that were originally there were still there with the same numbers.
Yeah,
the same channels.
And that was true for the patches too. General MIDI 2 was just an expansion. Yeah.
So, when MIDI first came out, they had a special cable. Do you remember the MIDI cable?
Oh, do I ever? I still have 2 MIDI cables in my house.
It was kind of like a wonky XLR cable because it had 5 pins. Here's something funny. The only 3 of those pins are currently used, or were initially used.
Really? Huh.
So
the other 2 are placeholders in case the code got expanded on or something?
Exactly.
Wow.
So pin 1 was
I didn't know that.
Yep. Pin 1 was no connect. Pin 2 was ground.
Okay.
Pin 3 was no connect. Pin 4 was 5-volt power.
Okay.
Pin 5 was the MIDI data. So all the MIDI information is being transmitted through this one
You
pin.
mean they could have just had one single flipping... I guess ground and 5-volt power is kind of important.
Exactly. Right. But I think the idea of having these other 2 cables were for future considerations, like you were saying. And I'm not sure if those have been expanded on. I think some of the pins have been expanded on by now.
Yeah, we should probably ask if anybody out there knows whether those pins have been expanded on.
Techies.
Yeah, you techie people, get in touch with us and let us know, because I'm genuinely interested. Yeah.
So the MIDI cable there's just the MIDI cable, regular 5-pin cable, both sides, 5 male on one end, female on the other. Right. But there's actually 3 different MIDI ports on a computer.
In, out, and through.
Now, why do we need the through?
It's a through port to send things onto some other place in your MIDI setup. These things could get kind of elaborate back in the day if you had 5 or 6 synths or what have you. You know, it became important to keep your sort of setup going. You know, basically, in would take MIDI data in
From another instrument.
This was important for your synth.
Or another machine, yeah.
Yeah, or your machine, like your PC. You know, so it would take the MIDI in and then play it or store it or whatever. Out is what sent MIDI out.
Right.
You know, so it would be important for your MIDI controller, the actual instrument you're playing on. You play it and then it creates that code and sends it out through the out port. So what the basic setup would be out the controller via MIDI out, which would on the other end of that MIDI cable be hooked into the MIDI in of your interface, which is connected via USB to your computer, right? And you've got something open like Digital Performer or whatever, and you're recording this, information and can manipulate it later. Also on that interface is an out that is sending that information. Then is on playback is sending that information out. And it's going into the in port of a synth, which is your actual sounds.
Yes.
Assuming you have a hardware synth, right? And then through would then, if you had another synth that you liked the guitar patch better on that or something, the through comes out of that,
And on to the next machine, right? Because that would not be possible without the through port because the in port actually terminates. So I kind of look at the through as kind of a splitter.
Sort of like a splitter.
For event information.
Yeah, I like to use bus station analogies or subway station analogies, and think of this as just a lane for the bus to just go straight through the station on its way to a different station.
Carrying all those little musical nuggets.
Carrying all those little musical informational ideas, performance ideas, action recordings, whatever. But we don't. Again, this is something that people don't always appreciate in this day and age because it's all internal. Your controller, your processor, and your synth is all, in your computer, or on your tablet. You don't really have to hook up these cables anymore, and it's kind of a shame.
Right, now that we have USB, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi and some other means of transmission, the MIDI cables really kind of become obsolete. There's really no need for it. I mean, all the information you need to transmit can be done through one USB cable.
Yeah, and all of this is just done via software now.
Right.
I mean, you just open up a piece of software and like GarageBand, for example, and all of this stuff is just there in the software. All these different, the controller and the processor and the synth is all just, it's just all on one screen. So people don't really appreciate what's going on as much as they used to.
So what else regarding MIDI?
Well, we need to talk about controllers.
Okay.
Because controllers sort of, they are also MIDI, so they are also code. They're not sound, but they are also code, and they're just code that is sort of, I don't want to say extraneous, code that is sort of supplementary to the actual code of the notes of when you hit it and whatever, that controls other aspects of a musical performance. For example, volume control is a big one, right? And General MIDI, while it was standardizing everything, also standardized a lot of controllers. So volume control is controller 7. So you might see a MIDI message where the code is CC7, controller 7, comma, and then a value between 0 and 127, which would be the volume. Pan controlling, 64 is straight up the middle.
Right.
0 is all the way to the left, 127 all the way to the right.
And everything in between just kind of sweeping somewhere.
Just, in your stereo environment. Sustain, there are actually only 2, right? There's a pedal down and pedal up.
Right.
Yeah, so that's normally controller 64. So CC 64, 127 is pedal down, which will make all notes last indefinitely, infinitely, until it gets to that, until it receives a message that is CC64, 0, which is pedal up, and then we'll stop. Great for piano music.
So it requires that command.
Right. Yeah.
Not unlike the velocity down.
Yeah.
Or the down velocity, right?
Yeah. Very similar. Yeah. And there are a lot of these that also affect your performance. And you can actually edit these in many instances separately from the actual notes itself. So this is what gives MIDI the ability to create volume swells and things. Now you can do controller 7 up. Yeah, and or controller 7 down, because you can enter these little values just sort of as fast as you want.
Long after you've played the initial note.
Yeah, big huge chain, and we would call these continuous controller. And would and they would just be streams of these messages that would create volume swells or move things left to right in the pan. So they were extraordinarily useful.
Very cool. So the controllers themselves are actually the functions, kind of.
Yeah, sort of the functions
based on music ideas and articulations.
Right. Yeah, they're just other types of MIDI messages that also contribute, that not necessarily its specific notes. And then of course there are MIDI channels, and there used to be only 16 in one MIDI cable. Now you can have as many as you want, right? But they're basically just sort of little avenues that you send different information through. They are what separates your different tracks. So your violin track might be on MIDI channel 1, which is set to play back on violin, right? And then your guitar track is MIDI channel 2, which is set to which is programmed to play back on a guitar patch, right? MIDI channel 10 is traditionally reserved for percussion instruments.
Okay.
This was another thing that General MIDI did. And in a lot of old software and instruments, channel 10 would only play back percussion. That's not necessarily the case anymore, but traditionally, channel 10 is still reserved for percussion.
So to make sure I have this right in my head, the original MIDI cable could only handle 16 instruments at a time?
Mm-hmm. If you wanted more than that, you needed another cable.
Okay. So let's talk about some kind of cool things let's talk about some fun, cool things that we do, how we use MIDI.
All right, let's do it.
Assuming we're done with the discussion on channels.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. I thought we should at least mention them.
Absolutely. Okay, well, here's how I use it. A lot of the stuff that I compose or that I try and put together, I'm not sure exactly how fast I want to do it. I'm not sure exactly what key I want to do it in. I'll just kind of come up with something.
Right.
And then I'll put it down.
Yeah.
And then, because of our friend MIDI, later on I can go back and change the tempo. I can make it faster. I can make it slower.
Mm-hmm.
I can just manipulate the notes however I want to. I can change the melodies. I can do anything I want to. And then, when I finally get the final feel and the final piece kind of how I want it, then I go back and record analog instruments over.
Yeah, so it's sort of a compositional tool.
It's very much a compositional tool, and it also kind of expedites the process, because you got a drum beat, you kind of dig, well, just copy and paste.
Yeah, right.
Down the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Go back later on and have a real drummer come in and do some cool stuff with it. But all I need right now is a hi-hat, a kick, and a snare.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And that helps me to keep the time when I'm actually going down and recording my analog instruments.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
So that's one of the main things that I benefit from with MIDI.
Yeah. Well, I compose a lot on music notation software.
Yeah.
And all of that is fundamental playback features are MIDI. They're creating MIDI messages. Notation software sort of have the notation side, which is an alphanumeric code. Mm-hmm. Right? And then they have the playback side, which is MIDI. They know how to translate a quarter note on the A above middle C into note 69, measure 1, beat 2, click 0. And so you can play it back instantly through MIDI messages. And then, those MIDI messages are sent to software like Garriton Personal Orchestra, for example, which I use a lot, or Contact, which we mentioned, or just the general MIDI that your computer's sound card has, because all computers have general MIDI on their sound cards now.
Right, and even QuickTime has general MIDI, correct?
Yes.
So if you have any kind of machine, and I assume Sibelius or the scoring softwares you use have their own general MIDI within the software, or do they access QuickTime general MIDI?
They access the general MIDI that is on your sound card. And because it's general MIDI, all of these, the number for the violin patch or whatever is still going to be the same, right? So they're basically just sending MIDI messages out to your sound card, which is kind of its own synth.
So whether you compose something in Finale or Sibelius or MuseScore, what I use,
Right.
the freeware, either way, it's still going to be the same sound if you have a violin patch.
As long as you stick to general MIDI, yeah.
We kind of digressed a little bit as we do,
Yeah.
but here's the takeaway. Here's what I really wanted people to get from your experience with MIDI.
Okay.
You can sit there on your music software and play something. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Absolutely.
Save it. Open it up in Sibelius or whatever scoring software you're using.
Yep.
And boom, there it is, notated.
Notated, yeah.
Already.
Ish.
Ish,
Depending on how accurately you played.
You executed, right?
And there's a thing in MIDI called quantizing.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that, but we need to.
Yeah, this is a good place to do that.
Yeah.
And what quantizing does basically is it takes your sloppy, inaccurate human performance and sort of averages it all out to a computer's level of accuracy.
Yeah.
And you can set these parameters. It will shift it over to make it absolutely excruciatingly accurate.
Yeah, robotic even.
Yeah. That's what you want to do if you're going to then open it in music notation, because music notation will have a 64th note tied to a, dotted 32nd or something,
It's going to make it exactly as you entered it.
Yeah.
So if you don't want a whole bunch of crazy weird stuff that you're not expecting, if you just want clean 64th notes or clean 16th notes,
yeah,
you want to quantize at 100%.
Yeah, right.
For the most part.
Yeah, well, quantize to the lowest note value you have. So quantize to the 16th note. Right. Then everything is going to be moved to the nearest 16th note. Mm-hmm.
So when you're quantizing, you're correcting for time.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah, you're correcting for time. Another one of those sort of controversial aspects of MIDI,
Yeah.
Because it does definitely sound robotic. You can hear that it is too accurate.
Right.
And there's the opposite of that is what we call humanizing.
Yes.
Something like Finale has, for example, which will just basically do the opposite of that. It'll take a random algorithm and just sort of move stuff around to make it sound human.
Chaotically and randomly.
Yeah.
To emulate human folly.
To emulate human folly. I don't know how well it actually works.
I've never done that, actually. I've never humanized it. I was always plenty human enough to where I didn't require any humanizing for my stuff.
Yeah, well, when you do it the way I do it, where, you're putting things into a musical score. Then you hit playback. Sometimes it sounds more robotic than you were hearing it in your head, and you think, And in Sibelius, they have rubato settings, which, the higher one, the more it randomizes things like that. Yeah.
Oh, and on the flip side of what we were speaking of earlier, you can actually notate something in Sibelius, save it as a MIDI file.
Yeah.
Open it up in Reason.
Or Reason or Pro Tools or whatever, yeah.
Any MIDI playing software, and it would recreate that.
Yeah, and have sort of a robotic version of somebody coming in and reading your score. Still won't sound as good as an actual human. Remember, that's always the best.
Man, let's keep those real musicians working.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's the absolute truth. I think the general consensus is that MIDI does not sound as good as live instruments. I can't imagine too many people are going to disagree with that.
This is the perfect time to talk about my sad story regarding MIDI.
All right, finally.
Now, 10 years ago about, when I first moved into this house and set up my little recording session, my little recording studio downstairs. This was my first time to really dig in. I mean, beyond what I did in Digital Performer back in school in 2002 or whatever. Right. I hadn't really messed with MIDI much. This was my first time to get reacquainted with MIDI. So I got Reason. I got Pro Tools, and I got Reason. Reason was going to be my main MIDI sequencing software.
Right.
So I thought that what I would try and do is get to working on creating soundscapes that could just be used as bumper music.
Right.
And I would send it into iStock Photo. At the time, they had an audio department, which I think became Getty Images ultimately. But then that became an auto. I think they bought out iStock, I think. Let's not worry about that. So there's this company, iStock, that I was going to send in some of my music to. Hopefully in that they would put it up on their site and make it available for people to download and use as bumper music. My goal, getting paid something for my music.
Right.
I decided I was going to go ahead and record something that was going to be, is called A Hero Is Laid to Rest. And it's the orchestral sound you might hear when they're panning over a war-torn area.
Okay.
It's like just really kind of slow
Yeah.
kind of sad, pensive,
Right. Yeah.
orchestral music. So I was
Right,
using
yeah.
strings and horns and stuff like that.
Yep.
So I sent it into iStock Photo, and I got this letter back that broke my heart. And I'm hesitant to share this with anyone, but bear in mind this is a while ago. And this is testimony to how important it is to actually play a MIDI instrument like the real instrument.
Right. Yeah.
So here, let me tell you what they wrote regarding this song in particular. The articulation of the MIDI within this file has not been fully realized.
Oh.
Even
okay.
that's not the worst. That's not the worst.
Doesn't sound good already.
That's the first sentence. Even the highest quality of samples, especially with strings, horns, and woodwinds, can sound extremely unreal if time is not committed to articulating the nuances of tone and performance that are normally associated with these instruments. Make sense?
Yeah.
We have many contributors and much content that demonstrates basic knowledge of orchestral samples, but we are now pushing for more contributors to push for a more professional use of sampled instruments.
Ooh.
To assure the long-term success of iStock Audio and in turn the success of our contributors, we are consistently asking our contributors to expand their abilities to higher levels of production. Before resubmitting these files, please take time to rework the performance and/or articulations to build this file. Try and achieve a feel that is more natural and indicative of how these instruments are typically performed and experienced.
So, in other words, learn to sample, noob.
In other words, learn how to make a keyboard sound like a violin.
Right.
Go.
Oh,
That was very hard to read.
I bet. Wow.
And people
Yeah, talk about harsh, too.
people in Thailand and people in South Africa and people in Canada and China will now know how.
We'll just now know that everybody gets stomped on at some point in their life, right?
That's part of being a musician. And I honestly, that's the first time I've been really critiqued.
Yeah.
I mean, my mom loves all the stuff I do.
I saw your mom the other day, by the way.
She mentioned that at the. But my friends, I'll play something for them. Oh yeah, that's cool. They're not going to sit there and tear it apart. This guy or woman was a complete stranger, and this was my test at the time,
Right.
based on my knowledge at the time. But the thing is, I knew better. I knew that you have to make a horn sound like a horn.
Yeah.
But I didn't know how to do that with a keyboard. I don't even know how to do it with the horn.
Yeah, and again, one of the great controversies of MIDI is that, it doesn't sound realistic.
Yeah.
Even the samples we have now, as this person was alluding to, it takes a lot of time to make those things sound, to sort of pass the musical Turing test.
Yeah.
Where somebody would, who was just listening to it would assume that it was somebody playing an instrument and not a synthesized sound. And it can take a lot of time.
Here's what I was banking on. I thought if I have enough textures in here, who's going to really notice the individual instruments and how they sound?
Yeah, no.
No. No.
It actually makes it worse because it's a little bit inaccurate to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And then you layer a little bit of inaccurate over a little bit of inaccurate, and it's like making a copy of a copy of a copy. And like a single solo violin is easier to make sound realistic than a string orchestra, in my personal opinion, anyway. With what little attempts I've made in my career to do that.
Well, what I ended up landing on was either this person had a hypersensitive, awesome, cool ears, or I was just that bad. Hopefully somewhere in between, right?
Well, this person probably listens to files from all over.
That's right? What he does. He or she does. Yeah.
Yeah. So her quality, or his or her quality level is attuned to the best.
But that's the kind of person I want feedback from, and I got it. And since then,
I actually find this an inspiring story because any successful person gets critiqued unduly harshly this way at some point in their life.
It's healthy.
Yeah, I've had people tell me that I have no talent for composing whatsoever, and I should just stop.
Really?
That I should just stop and find something that I'm good at to do.
God, people are such jerks.
Yeah, and of course I didn't do that.
Yeah,
right?
no. But this person wasn't being a jerk. They were being brutally honest.
Being brutally honest, yeah. That's true. I
brutally.
guess brutal honesty versus being.
They're very nice about it, I think.
Oh,
That's my MIDI
that
story, man.
sucks.
Yeah.
That sucks.
But the takeaway is, and honestly, since then, I decided that I wanted to try and hone that craft and get good at articulating MIDI to sound like real instruments, if not just to hold a place for when real musicians wanted to come in and fill in those parts. But ultimately, I felt that I was better off going with what I knew. Most of my soundscapes would be a mixture of computer and analog instruments,
Yeah.
but nothing that I don't have on hand.
Right, yeah.
So I'm pretty happy with MIDI organ sounds, piano sounds.
Those are kind of the things it does best. Anything relatively percussive, like harp,
Yeah.
it kind of it smooths over better. The string issue, the strings, vocals, anything,
vocals,
horns and woodwinds, anything like that. It's just so hard to get it. I mean, those sound waves are so complex.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's just it fundamentally works against the way MIDI works, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
if you go from playing one note of violin to another note on the violin, what's happening in out in the real world and sound world is not that the frequency of the first note stopped and the frequency of the second note began, which is how MIDI interprets it.
Mm-hmm.
The frequency of that first note sped up into or slowed down into the next, right? That's what's really happening. It's the same string that's vibrating.
Mm-hmm. We don't have the technology to articulate that just yet.
Not really.
We have to find ways around.
We're getting closer, but
Yeah.
Whereas with the piano, one string created the note, right? Then the next string created the note, and this is kind of the way MIDI works, right? In a way,
So to that point, when I'm doing MIDI, when I'm using MIDI and I'm using computer music, I'm sticking with like sine waves and things that are clearly computer generated. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's not to say I'm running away. I'm not running away from the idea of doing a violin piece, on a keyboard. But at the same time,
I know violin players.
I'm sure you probably have a handful of great musicians that you can pick from.
Yeah.
Of course, that they don't come cheap.
Not typically. Some have been very nice. And I'm always grateful for that. But they don't come cheap. But you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, right, cheap, or fast. Choose two.
Right. So that was a great experience for me.
It sounds like it. Wow. We talk a lot about on this podcast occasionally about career paths and being a musician and how to make yourself happy and things. And, it's unfortunate part of reality, not just for musicians, I think, but just for anybody who ultimately wants to become successful, is you kind of have to deal with people like that.
If I had stayed in my bubble, in my comfort zone, I would have never gotten that feedback that I desperately needed, I think.
Yeah, and you probably came out better for it, right?
I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
A little shell-shocked at first. But ultimately a better musician because of it. Now let me ask you this, Matt.
Okay.
Have you ever made one of your final pieces a MIDI file based on virtual instruments?
Versus live musicians?
Yes.
One time. Generally what I do is designed for live musicians. My intent is to have it performed live by real musicians. But I did do a score once for an independent film in which the final product was a MIDI file that was tuned using one of the more that was put through one of the more expensive and high quality sample libraries, East West Coast Symphonic Library or something like that. I always forget the actual name, but I did do that once, and it was sort of a separate process from composing all of the music to actually putting it into this sample library and working with getting it to sound as close to real instruments as possible. Mm-hmm. And that was like a whole other facet of the creation after I had written the notes I wanted.
Right. And I assume this is budget-based.
Yeah, this was budget-based. I was in graduate school getting my master's degree, so I had access to one of the best sample libraries out there, for one thing.
which clearly makes a big difference. I think at the time I was using Reason, maybe Reason 4.
Yeah. As always, you get what you pay for. The more expensive you get, the higher quality generally. But you can go look at things like East West Symphonic Library. You can go look at things like Garriton Personal Orchestra. You can look at Contact, which is still around, and all of these sites. They have demonstrations of what their samples sound like. Now, keep in mind, this is putting their best foot forward, right?
Yeah.
But you can go listen to them, see what and judge for yourself which ones you think you like the best versus how much they cost, what your budget is, and what have you.
But even if you have the best samples, we've kind of learned that you have to still go back and tweak it and articulate. Do you remember some of the things that you did to make it sound more natural or more human-like, as they say?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of things. For example, with violins, there is a portamento controller in MIDI, which will create sort of little slides. So rather than just the note happening,
right?
Perfectly. You can create little, and I'm talking about just little, almost imperceptible slides up to microtonal, happens in a fraction of a second, little slide up. That or slide down, which would give it a little bit more. It sounded like somebody was actually moving their fingers along a fretboard.
Yeah,
so it would give it a little bit more of a human quality. And there was definitely not something you did every single note and make it sound, because and it definitely wasn't an effect you overdid, right? But it's in terms of the dramaticness of it. But, just little ones every once in a while would make it sound a little more human. You could add breath effects to the flutes and things, making it sound like somebody was breathing, which could be little things like that could make it. I seem to remember there were times when I would do that with volume too, like when something was starting to play, like when the basses would start a note. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but an upright bass bowed, a contrabass bowed, it takes a minute for it to go before it, it takes that little split second for the string to start vibrating with enough force to actually be creating the sound wave. So, having a little bit of a pre-delay on that note, little things like that to make it a little more human.
Now, these are things that you, having worked with so many different parts of the orchestra, have like an understanding of, whereas I didn't quite have that,
Yeah, there's only one way to get that understanding.
And I don't have the time or the money for that.
I know. At some point, it's you really are. I mean, there's definitely a career path in learning how to make these things sound realistic, because there are a lot of games out there. There are a lot of commercials out there,
which is another market I wanted to tap into.
Yeah. That use synthetic sampled sounds now. That are MIDI controlled, and they can. And in the hands of someone who's really good at it, better than me, these things can sound extremely realistic. They sort of pass that musical Turing test of, if you're not really listening closely, you can just assume it's an orchestra or whatever and go on with your life.
They still had to take those considerations.
Yeah, so it's if that's something you're interested in, it's definitely worth learning how to do well. Like I said, what I do every day is really kind of designed for, it's kind of artsy, and so it's designed to be played by live musicians. That's kind of the point. But if that's less the point, then definitely look into doing that.
Very good. Well, cool, man. Well, I think that's a pretty in-depth discussion of MIDI pros and cons, and
I think so. Yeah,
the coolness that it is, and how it's changed my life.
Yeah, and you can go online and download all sorts of great information about MIDI. You can get a complete list of all the MIDI controllers. You can get a full and detailed description of what General MIDI does and what it standardizes and things. There's definitely some information out there if you're curious.
And let us know if we left anything out.
Absolutely. We almost certainly did. So, let us know what we left out.
So our first venture into the tech world, again, this is not a tech podcast, but again, we're going to try and share some things with you that we think are important to being a musician.
Yeah, consider this sort of junior intermediate level tech.
And I'm going to try and have a good list of some podcasts to listen to. Our next tech episode we do will probably be like Studio Basics,
Right, yeah.
compression, reverb, that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I'll try and have a nice list of some good tech podcasts because I've
Good
been listening
plan.
to a lot of them. So,
Good plan.
thanks again, and we hope to see you soon.
See you soon.
If you have something you'd like to contribute to our MIDI conversation, write us at info@musicstudent101.com.